It was a quiet morning during harvest season when I walked out to find my $300,000 tractor missing. Not moved, not blocked, gone. Just like that. Why? Because some HOA president named Karen thought it was too ugly for her perfect neighborhood. And the crazy part? She had no idea what she'd just started. See, that tractor wasn't just mine. It was part of a state-leased farm operation, and when Karen decided to take matters into her own hands, she messed with more than just my farming equipment. She unknowingly crossed into federal territory. I've been living on the edge of this little suburban area for almost a decade. I run a small farming business on land that's just outside of the HOA's jurisdiction. We've always kept to ourselves. Me with my fields and harvests, them with their backyard barbecues and neighborhood gossip. But that peace didn't last. Karen, who'd always been a little too keen on telling others how to live, somehow got herself elected president of the HOA. At first, it seemed harmless, but the moment she got that title, it was like she'd found a new hobby, making everyone else's life miserable. At first, it was complaints about my roosters crowing too loud, or my grain silos looking ugly. Nothing major. But then came harvest season. That's when Karen made her biggest mistake. And what started as a petty dispute over visual aesthetics turned into a full-blown mess involving federal inspectors, state authorities, and a $300,000 tractor. Spoiler alert, Karen had no idea what she was getting into. But trust me, by the time this was over, she'd wish she never touched my tractor. I've lived on the edge of this little suburban neighborhood for almost 10 years. My property borders the HOA, so it's kind of like I'm just outside their bubble. I do my farming, planting crops, harvesting, and minding my own business. The folks in the HOA mostly stay to their side, doing their own thing. Backyard barbecues, block parties, and the usual neighborhood gossip. For the most part, we kept things quiet. I did my thing in the fields, and they handled their lawns and little community events. It was a peaceful coexistence. I stayed on my side, they stayed on theirs, and everyone was happy. Then came Karen. She wasn't always the nightmare she would later become. At first, she was just another neighbor, but somewhere along the line, she got it in her head that she should be the one in charge. And when she became the president of the HOA, things started to change. It was like flipping a switch. Before, everything was calm, just people living their lives. But once Karen had that title, it was like she suddenly had a need to control every little thing around her. She started noticing things that had never bothered her before. Small things, like the sound of my roosters crowing in the mornings, or the way my grain silos looked. They were just a part of life on a farm. But to Karen, they were an eyesore. At first, it seemed harmless, just a few complaints here and there. Maybe she didn't like how the roosters clucked at dawn, or how my grain silos towered over the landscape. It was minor, really. I'd brush it off and keep working. But as time went on, I started to feel like she was looking for things to complain about. It wasn't just about my farm anymore. She'd show up at the edge of my property with a clipboard, looking like she was on some sort of mission. I'd wave, and she'd just scowl, pointing out something new that was ruining the neighborhood. Still, it was all small stuff. I figured she'd get over it eventually. Little did I know, this was just the beginning. And when harvest season came, Karen was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. The sun was just beginning to rise over the horizon, casting a warm orange glow over the fields as I fired up the tractor to start the harvest season. It's always a busy time of year, but there's something peaceful about it. The sound of the combine's engine rumbling to life, the steady hum of the machine cutting through the rows of crops. It's like a rhythm I've come to know. The cool morning air filled my lungs as I cracked open the window of the cab and let the smell of fresh soil and growing things mix with the sound of Johnny Cash playing softly in the background. There's a certain calm to it all, even if it's the busiest time of year. With 160 acres of state-leased farmland to harvest, there was no time to waste. I had a job to do, but as I made my way across the field, working my way through the golden corn rows, I saw her. Karen, standing at the edge of the property, arms crossed, clipboard in hand, like she was preparing for a confrontation. I sighed, knowing what was coming. She'd been quiet for a few weeks, but it was clear that harvest time was going to be too much for her to ignore. She marched over to the edge of the field, her eyes locked on my tractor like it was some sort of monstrous machine. "This is a violation!" she yelled across the field, her voice carrying in the crisp morning air. "Your equipment is disrupting the visual experience for the neighborhood." I almost choked on my coffee when I heard her words. Visual experience? Really? I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. I waved at her and yelled back, "It's a tractor, Karen." Not the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Nothing to get worked up about. She wasn't having it, though. "This is an eyesore for the community," she snapped, her voice full of authority, like she was the final word on what could and couldn't be seen from her precious neighborhood. She held up her clipboard like it was some official document and looked at me as if she was about to deliver a ruling. I rolled my eyes and walked over, trying not to laugh. "Karen, this land is leased by the state. It's not part of your HOA. It's farmland, and I'm doing my job," I explained, trying to keep things light. But Karen wasn't listening. She stood there, arms still crossed, with that same look of self-righteousness, and said, "It's within our visual domain. You're lowering property values. People can't even look out their windows without seeing that thing." I blinked a few times, trying to process the fact that she was treating a tractor like it was some sort of disaster. "Karen, I'm not trying to ruin anyone's day here," I said, shaking my head. "I'm just farming. But I'll tell you what. I'll move it if you can show me where your jurisdiction starts and ends." That's when I realized she didn't care about the facts. She didn't care that the land was leased to the state and that it was managed by federal agricultural regulations. In her mind, the HOA's visual domain was the only thing that mattered. And that was about to cause a whole lot of problems for her. After a long day of work, I finished up in the field, locked up the tractor, and headed back to the house. It was like any other evening. I figured Karen would probably complain again. Maybe send another one of her passive-aggressive flyers, or show up at my fence line with her clipboard. It was becoming the usual routine. But I didn't think much of it. I went inside, had a quick dinner, and called it a day. The next morning, I grabbed my coffee and headed out early to get back to work. As I walked toward the barn, something immediately felt off. I didn't see the familiar outline of my tractor sitting there on the gravel path where I'd left it. At first I thought maybe I'd parked it somewhere else by mistake, or maybe I was just half asleep. But no, it was gone. Completely gone. My heart dropped as I walked around, checking the area, just to make sure I wasn't missing something. There was nothing. Just an empty spot where the tractor should have been. My first thought was that maybe the state had moved it for inspection. But then I realized they would have called me, and there were no missed calls on my phone. That's when I saw it. Taped to the side of the barn, a little piece of paper fluttering in the wind. It read, "Towed. Abandoned machinery, reported by HOA safety oversight." I stood there for a second, just staring at it, trying to figure out if this was some kind of joke. But when the reality set in, it hit like a ton of bricks. Karen had actually done it. She had gone behind my back, called a towing company, and had my $300,000 combine hauled off in the middle of harvest season. This wasn't just a small annoyance anymore. It wasn't just a petty complaint. It was serious. I felt a mix of anger and disbelief. How could she be that bold, that ignorant? But as the fog of shock started to clear, the wheels in my head started turning. This wasn't just any tractor. It was part of a state-licensed agricultural operation. I leased the land from the state, and that tractor wasn't just a piece of farm equipment. It was part of a government-regulated operation. Karen had just interfered with a federal matter. I paused for a second, thinking it through. If she had called some random towing company, they probably didn't even know the legal implications. But I knew. And suddenly, the situation went from something annoying to something much bigger. Tampering with a state-leased tractor in the middle of an active harvest window wasn't just a neighborhood squabble, it was a federal offense. And I had a feeling this was going to get a lot more complicated for Karen. I wasn't about to let this slide. I wasn't going to just file another complaint or let her get away with it. No, this was bigger than that now. The state would handle it. I was going to make sure of it. And Karen? She had no idea what she'd just done. By noon, things were already starting to escalate. The moment I made the call to the state agricultural department, I knew things were about to get real. Within a few hours, a couple of state inspectors showed up, along with a sheriff's deputy and a transportation compliance officer. It was like a mini government task force arriving to handle what had started as a petty neighborhood dispute. They weren't here to check the tractor's legality or whether I was doing something wrong. No, they were here to figure out why Karen decided to mess with state property and make it a bigger issue than it needed to be. I could see Karen out of the corner of my eye, marching down the driveway in her bright neon orange windbreaker, looking like she was preparing to lead a parade. When she spotted the inspector with his clipboard, her face went from confused to defensive, real quick. The inspector didn't waste any time. He turned to Karen and, with a smirk, calmly explained, "Ma'am, you're aware that this land is leased by the State Agricultural Authority, and it falls under protected infrastructure during operational windows, correct?" Karen blinked, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. She clearly hadn't expected that response. "What do you mean? It was just sitting there, in our visual range. It was an eyesore for the neighborhood," she snapped, arms flailing like she was still trying to convince herself she was in the right. The inspector raised an eyebrow, clearly not impressed. "Ma'am," he said, still calm, "this is a state-regulated agricultural operation. You don't have any legal jurisdiction here. This is a federal matter now." That's when Karen's bravado started to crack. She was beginning to realize that she'd crossed a line she didn't even know existed. I stepped in, keeping my tone level, but making sure she understood what was happening. "Karen," I said, "I lease the entire 160 acres of land surrounding your neighborhood. It's not just some random patch of ground, it's state-leased farmland, part of a federally managed agricultural program. You didn't just call a towing company, you interfered with a state operation." Karen's face turned red, then purple, as she tried to backtrack. "I didn't know the rules," she blurted, almost pleading. "This wasn't supposed to happen. Someone on the board told me it was okay." She was trying to pass the blame off to anyone else, but at that point, no one was buying it. The inspector didn't give her a chance to explain further. He started documenting everything, taking notes and snapping photos of the scene. It was clear to me that Karen's actions had just turned from a nuisance to a full-blown legal issue. I could see her trying to regroup, her mind clearly racing as she realized the gravity of what she'd done. The more the inspector talked, the more she sank into her own mess. And that was just the beginning. The moment she involved the state, she had stepped into a world she didn't understand, and now she was going to have to deal with the consequences. 2 days later, the situation took another turn. The same agricultural compliance officer who had visited earlier showed up again, but this time he was accompanied by someone new, a tall, well-dressed man carrying a briefcase. I didn't need to ask who he was. The seal on the side of his SUV said it all. Department of Infrastructure Integrity. The new investigator explained how Karen's actions had escalated far beyond what she thought. At first, it was just about the tractor being unsightly to her precious neighborhood. But now, it was a full-blown violation of federal law. He laid it out clearly. Karen hadn't just had my tractor towed. She had interfered with critical agricultural infrastructure during a state-managed operation, which could disrupt the entire food production process. Suddenly, her petty decision to act like the neighborhood's personal sheriff had put her in hot water. To make things worse for her, the state investigators had dug a little deeper. They uncovered Karen's email where she'd bragged about how she saved the neighborhood by having my tractor towed. She had sent it out to all the HOA members, boasting about her actions like she'd just won a battle. That email became the key piece of evidence against her. In it, she admitted to knowing exactly what she did and thinking she was in the right. As a result, the farmers were officially cleared, and Karen's days of holding power over the HOA were numbered. But the legal trouble wasn't the only fallout from this mess. As word got out, the neighborhood started to take notice. People who had stayed quiet in the past started talking, and not in Karen's favor. A few residents came to my farm to apologize for the chaos she had caused. They offered to shake my hand, and some even brought gifts: pies, coffee, a few bottles of local wine. It was clear that they were starting to see Karen for what she was, and they didn't want to be associated with her anymore. The HOA board, meanwhile, was starting to distance itself from Karen, too. There were hushed conversations, meetings behind closed doors, and more than one whispered comment about how much damage Karen had done to the community. Karen's overreach had cost the HOA more than just a few complaints. It was starting to fracture the trust between the board and the residents. People weren't just upset about the tractor incident anymore. They were realizing that Karen had used the HOA as her personal tool to push through her own agenda. Whispers about her misconduct started spreading like wildfire, and the more people talked, the worse it looked for her. At the same time, the mood in the neighborhood began to shift. The people who once seemed too afraid to stand up to Karen were now openly speaking out against her actions. They were fed up with her self-righteous attitude and her constant meddling. It was clear that Karen had alienated a lot of people, and as the story unfolded, she was losing any support she had left. As Karen's world began to crumble, I could only watch. She had created a mess so big that there was no way to clean it up. The neighborhood, once her little kingdom to control, was now turning against her, and the fallout from her actions was just beginning to spread. By now, Karen had made a mess of everything, and I knew it was time to play my final card. I'd been holding on to this little piece of land for a while, but now it was time to make it count. I owned the access road that led into the HOA, a small stretch of gravel that connected their neighborhood to the county road. I hadn't mentioned it before because it wasn't something I needed to use all the time, but now, with everything that had gone down, I knew it was my chance to really drive the point home. I filed the paperwork to officially rename the road. It wasn't much to ask, just a small fee, some legal paperwork, and soon enough, it was official. The road was now Tractor Way, a small but powerful symbol of my victory over Karen. This wasn't just about getting back at her. It was about making sure that everyone who entered or left that neighborhood would be reminded of who had the power in this situation. The HOA had no choice but to update their address and website to reflect the new road name. And just like that, Karen's little kingdom started to crumble. From now on, every time someone drove into that neighborhood, they'd have to pass under a sign that read, Tractor Way. And the best part? Karen's house was right there, at the edge of the neighborhood, with a permanent reminder of her overreach every time she or anyone else left. That name, right in front of her, was a mark of her failure and arrogance. It was a reminder of how her attempt to control everything had backfired in the most public way possible. Karen, of course, wasn't going down quietly. She tried to save face by planning a big fall festival for the HOA. It was supposed to be a grand event. Food trucks, live music, hay rides, the works. She figured it would help rebuild her reputation and make people forget about the mess she'd caused. But it was too little. Too late. By the time the festival rolled around, the damage was already done, and the neighbors had lost all patience with her. I decided to host my own event. Nothing fancy, just a good old-fashioned harvest celebration. It was simple. Tractor demos, homemade kettle corn, live bluegrass music, and a bonfire. No rules, no drama, just a fun, family-friendly day out. And the best part? The neighbors showed up in droves. People were laughing, eating, dancing, and having a great time. Some of them had even brought their kids, and they stayed for hours. Meanwhile, Karen's festival was a disaster. The food trucks didn't show, the hay rides were canceled, and there were more empty seats than there were people. It looked like a failed middle school fundraiser. Karen stood there in the middle of it all, trying to act like everything was fine, but it was clear to anyone who was paying attention that her event was a total bust. The real fun was happening over at my place, where everyone was enjoying themselves without the cloud of Karen's constant control hanging over them. When people started drifting away from her sad little festival and heading over to mine, Karen must have realized she was losing. Fast. The contrast couldn't have been more obvious. She was out there trying to hold on to a title she no longer deserved, while the rest of us were just enjoying life. And as the day wore on, it was clear that Karen had lost her grip on the neighborhood. Even after everything that had happened, Karen wasn't ready to give up. She decided to make one final desperate attempt to regain control. She appealed to the county, trying to get the road declared a public right-of-way. Her logic was that since so many people used it to get to and from the neighborhood, it should be maintained by the county. She figured that if she could get the road to be recognized as public, she'd have some leverage over the whole situation again. But she didn't realize that I'd been working behind the scenes to make sure that didn't happen. I'd already been in contact with the county, and instead of letting her win, I took matters into my own hands. I filed the paperwork to turn the road into a private agricultural easement. That meant I owned it, and only those with a permit could use it. A few days later, the county installed a gate at the entrance to the road, with a sign that read, "Private Agricultural Road, entry by permit only." It was clear. The road was mine, and Karen had no say in who could use it. When Karen refused to acknowledge the new status and kept using the road as if nothing had changed, she soon found herself in a real bind. Every time she tried to leave the neighborhood, she'd have to take the long way out, down a bumpy gravel path full of potholes that skirted a creek and passed through old ranch land. It added at least 20 minutes to her trip, and it was miserable. Meanwhile, everyone else in the neighborhood had easy access through the new gate. It was a small but satisfying way to remind Karen that she no longer held the power she once thought she did. As Karen's days in the neighborhood wore on, her reputation continued to crumble. The same neighbors who had once feared her now talked openly about what she'd done. Word spread that Karen was trying to take control of everything, and it wasn't long before the cracks in her facade started to show. Eventually, her house went up for sale, and within a few weeks, she was gone. She moved to a condo on the other side of town, where there was no farmland and no tractor drama to deal with. The neighborhood, on the other hand, slowly returned to normal. People stopped whispering about Karen and started enjoying the peace again. The HOA was a lot quieter without her running the show, and even the people who had been on her side started to realize they were better off without her. As for me, my quiet victory felt even better knowing that I hadn't had to do anything dramatic, just stand my ground and let the truth do the work. The neighborhood was mine, Karen was gone, and life went back to its usual rhythm. As I sat on the porch that evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. What started as a simple misunderstanding had turned into a battle I never expected to fight. But in the end, it wasn't about getting back at Karen or seeking revenge. It was about standing my ground. It was about knowing the rules and using them to protect my farm, my livelihood, and the peace I'd worked so hard to maintain. The whole thing had been a test of patience. It would have been easy to lose my cool, to get wrapped up in the drama of it all, but that's not how I wanted to win. The real victory wasn't in the confrontations or the paperwork. It was in holding my head high, knowing I'd done what was right. Karen had tried to control everything, but I'd shown that there were limits to how far someone could go. Now, with everything settled, I could finally relax. The field was quiet, the breeze gentle, and the only sound was the rustle of the crops. It was a peaceful evening, and as I watched the last light fade, I knew I had won, not through fighting, but by sticking to my principles. And that was all I needed.